Thymesia is a Souls-like action RPG set in a dark misty world. Souls-likes generally feature grim, deep lore, an emphasis on exploration, build-heavy protagonists, and a typically gloomy, gothic aesthetic, and they're also hard as nails. And yet, despite their punishing difficulty, steep learning curve, and joyless demeanor, the Souls-like genre has enraptured a huge community of devotees, won over by From Software epics such as Demon's Souls, Bloodborne, and one of the finest releases of the year to date, Elden Ring. The game begins with the main character, who is a Corvus, an amnesiac plague doctor of sorts, who may have had a hand in the creation of a concoction that could save the kingdom, and put an end to experimentation with alchemy. The game has 3 zones. Thymesia only has 3 main areas. After completing the main objective in each location, which ends with a boss fight, side missions are unlocked that take place in the same area. The number of these vary, and you typically only see them pop up after the previous one is done. These side quests use up the same general location, but their layouts are adjusted somewhat, blocking off certain sections, and opening up others. This is part of why the level design in Thymesia is its worst quality. Your first time around, you'll come across locked doors and blocked off areas you'd think can be unlocked through normal progression, but many only do in side quests. This will have you running around a level you've entirely cleared of enemies just to find how to get past a locked gate or reach a higher story. The lighting in most levels makes this a chore. You will miss ladders and open hatches on countless occasions even as you repeatedly ran past them, only to later catch them at a weird angle and figure out they are what you needed to push forward. Enemy visibility is another casualty of the lighting engine. It's harder to detect enemies than in many of Thymesia's genre contemporaries. It doesn't help that the game is a little too fond of setting traps to force you into fights with multiple enemies. Your only solution was to simply spam lock on to detect enemies and kill them. The Elden Ring, a dungeon flows naturally from one distinct room to a hallway to an open plaza. Thymesia's levels feel like textured blueprints that do little to communicate character. The third location, in particular, set in a castle, is a nightmare to navigate. It's an interconnected maze of several floors and an underground area that all link up through stairs, ladders, locked gates, and good old drops. Because the layout never makes sense, you will spend most of time simply using enemies as a sort of compass. The lack of any sort of map, or item you can use to mark off areas, makes this all the more frustrating. Thymesia's combat style is way different than Dark Souls or Elden Ring games. It is the most polished and often impressive part of it. You can run, dodge, and attack as often as you want without worrying about using up a stamina at all times. This is an action game at heart, doing away with stamina-based limitations altogether. The main hook to the combat is the plague mechanic. With every hit to an enemy, you deal damage to them. This depletes their white health bar to reveal a green bar underneath. If you don't stay on the offensive, wounds will heal and the green will slowly turn into white. But to deal damage to the green bar, you need to use your claw. Claw attacks can deal standard damage, but they're best at capitalizing on plague damage instead. Gladly there is upgrades that boost the plague damage your strikes deal to enemies, and delay their regeneration. That system is unique, and suggests a sort of back and forth style of fighting. A more cautious player will effectively have to contend with 2 health bars for every enemy. This is especially true for bosses, whose already gigantic health pools feel ever more daunting as you see them regenerating HP while you try to avoid their long attack chains. Your only main weapon is a saber, which has a standard light attack combo. You can't modify its reach, or increase hit damage through heavy attacks. It cannot be upgraded, either, meaning you're always limited by what it can do from beginning to end. Enemy attack chains, however, are often lengthy, with long reach and accurate tracking. Spamming dodge can help you avoid them, but that lost time is enough for them to regain HP. Even dodging can be risky thanks to the game's brief invincibility frames. Thymesia's dodge is a little floaty, and hard to master, and you're going to get hit if you miss time your dodge even a little. This will make some players to rage quit the game or lose their cool while playing this game. Worry not, there is a super armor, a technique that prevents enemies' attacks from being interrupted by your own, is also a factor. The existence of that mechanic is fine, of course, but it's never clear which enemies and which attacks come with super armor, and that can make boss fights frustrating when you don't know which moves are safe to punish. The developer clearly wanted players to rely on plague weapons, which are essentially magic attacks that use up energy. The more you run into enemies, the more of their plague weapons they'll use against you, and that's really where the build diversity comes into play. There are nearly 24 of these to discover, and they can be upgraded by earning shards from defeated enemies wielding each one. Later into the game, it becomes almost a necessity to open up with a plague attack. By investing into shortening their cooldowns and widening the energy pool, they can effectively turn into your main tool rather than an ancillary. The final component of combat is parrying, but its implementation is likewise puzzling. By timing your block to catch the enemy's weapon just before it hits you, you can parry. But don't expect this to stagger the enemy and open them up for a big damage attack. What happens instead is that some of their attack damage is transferred back to them, but they'll continue their chain like nothing happened. There's a faint, but recognizable audio cue that accompanies a parry, but you'll quickly realize it's not worth figuring out the timing or listening for that cue. Dodging is a much safer and guaranteed way of avoiding damage. Certain enemy attacks are perilous, and can either be avoided entirely or interrupted with a feather throw. Like parrying, you need to time this correctly. Unfortunately, this is yet another underbaked mechanic you'll quickly abandon. The window you're given to punish after a successful interruption is simply too narrow to be effective. It's so short, in fact, it will likely be over by the time you get closer to the staggered enemy, particularly if you interrupted a ranged attack. Outside the different plague weapons you can find in the game, Thymesia does a fair job at offering diverse builds. Every time you level up, you gain a talent point, which can be spent on unlocking new moves, enhancing existing ones, or adding new variations to them. The number of points is capped, so you will not be able to acquire everything. Some paths also lock you out of others. For instance, you can widen the parry window and decrease its effect, or shorten it and make it more effective. You can freely respec the entire tree or individual talents at any time, in skill menu. Thymesia feels like an under-budget first game from a new studio. Setting aside the surprisingly small number of locations and limited enemy variety, certain aspects are curiously underfunded. There's no voice acting in the game whatsoever, despite there being cutscenes, and several boss quotes. Publisher Team 17, however, confirmed that there are no plans to add voice acting. But this level of production value is bound to make a poor first impression. You can see the makeup of a good game at the heart of Thymesia, but it seems the team was only capable of delivering a prototype, the building blocks of something greater, before it tapped out. You can easily spend 10-ish hours with the game, and potentially longer if you decide to experiment with builds. Thymesia is the latest entry in the Souls-like genre, a collection of games that draw inspiration from the brutally difficult Dark Souls series, but Thymesia doesn't do enough to innovate on that formula, or commit to standing on its own feet. It feels like Thymesia is content to be a shallow reflection of From Software's hits, which is a shame because it squanders some genuinely captivating ideas. This all adds up to a poor picture of Thymesia, but it's not all bad. When OverBorder Studio taps into its creative side, it pays off. One of the game's earlier levels is a cyst-ridden stilt town that leads into an unsettling circus. Through a smattering of discarded letters and pamphlets, you get the feeling that something's not quite right with this carnival, and in no time you're doing battle with a hammer-wielding clown, a hulking mutant, and the show's sinister ringmaster. This area in particular is a highlight for Thymesia, and shows off the game's best side, where the developer is willing to explore its own ideas. Thymesia's main character, Corvus, also feels brilliant to play. Corvus specializes as being a fast, nimble fighter. Combo attacks from his saber are light and quick to land, and staying alive means weaving parries, dodge rolls and plague attacks into the technique. Thymesia also gives players room to reinforce their playstyle through a branching skill tree. Cautious players may opt for skills that reward Corvus with defensive boosts during combat, while others may spend their upgrade points on opposing skills that reward players for being an aggressive fighter. Many of these abilities feel like tangible improvements. Unlocking an extra dodge will save your life countless times, while an extended attack combination helps cut your opponent to ribbons in record time. Even while Corvus falls victim to Thymesia's inconsistent combat, getting to develop his abilities over time remains satisfying. But unfortunately, not much else in Thymesia develops as well as Corvus. The game attempts to drip-feed world-building via heaps of lore collectibles, but they aren't written well enough, and the world isn't interesting enough to make them compelling. There's a sense of detachment to Thymesia's story, made all the worse for characters who speak only through subtitles. A lack of voice acting means most cutscenes are delivered with an awkward, empty silence. Overall, Thymesia is a confused game that feels too much like a mimicry of its inspirations, which casts a shadow over Thymesia's more interesting ideas. Thymesia launches on August 18 for PC, Xbox Series X and S, and PS5. This is all we know about the game. Comment below what's your thoughts on this game. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon for future notifications of upcoming contents. See you guys on the next one.